Welcome to chapter 15 of Intro to Psychology. In this video, I'll be discussing perspectives on psychological disorders. We'll be talking about the etiology, the causes of psychological disorders, and how people have thought about the causes of psychological disorders over the course of history. We're answering the question, what causes some people to experience psychological disorders? Why do some people go on to develop depression, OCD, these other diagnoses? And others do not. There have been three basic explanations for why some people develop psychological disorders over the course of history. The first and earliest understanding was the supernatural perspective, that psychological disorders are attributed to forces beyond scientific understanding, that God caused psychological disorders, or mental disorders were caused by spirits or supernatural beings, or people using witchcraft or voodoo to induce mental illness. And those ideas have persisted for a long time throughout history, even to this day. Another explanation for the etiology of psychological disorders is the biological perspective, that psychological disorders are attributed to differences in genes or genetic expression or neurochemical abnormalities in the brain on the level of synapses or on the level of brain regions. And the final perspective is the psychological perspective, which is that psychological disorders are attributed to things related to how people think and feel, stress, learned behaviors, learned ways of thinking, self-defeating thinking patterns, or other aspects of the social environment that lead to distress. And so prehistorical views of mental illness were dominated by superstition regarding supernatural causes of mental illness. One important example of this is trephination, which is one of the earliest treatments for mental illness. The examination of prehistoric skulls and cave art from as early as 6,500 BC has identified surgical drilling holes that were found in skulls of people who were believed to have had some kind of disturbing behavior or abnormal behavior, such as people who had epilepsy or people who had head injuries. And the belief was that by drilling these holes into the skull, evil spirits that were causing mental illness would be able to escape through the skull, that evil spirits were trapped inside the skull. And so they were somewhat correct in their understanding that many mental disorders have to do with what's going on inside the skull, but their attribution was wrong, that they attributed it to very narrowly to evil spirits rather than any other abnormalities in brain functioning. Next, in around the 2700 BC, the notion that physical diseases could lead to mental illness was introduced in ancient China. And so you have the philosophy of yin versus yang, which is an ancient philosophy regarding imbalance within the body and within the mind, that people would developmental disorders because their two passions or the two sides of their spirit were out of sync or were not in balance. And so they treated this form of imbalance in mental illness using herbs, using acupuncture, and using other holistic remedies. So they were actually treating the body. And so they had moved on from just a superstitious perspective of mental disorders and actually moving into treating the body and the brain specifically. Next, we have findings from classical Greece and Egypt, where many medical philosophers sought to reject supernatural causes and introduce more scientific thinking, we would call it today. And they were among the first to introduce the idea that mental disorders could be caused by psychological experiences or traumatic events. For example, the Greek physician and philosopher Galen suggested that both diseases and differences in personality could be explained by imbalances in what he called the four humors. These were substances that he believed were running throughout every person's body, and that Every person would tend to exhibit one of four main temperaments based on the humors that are running through their body. So there's the choleric person who's passionate, ambitious, and bold, the melancholic person who's reserved, anxious, and unhappy, the sanguine person who's joyful, eager, and optimistic, and the phlegmatic person who is calm, reliable, and thoughtful. And these terms we still use today. We often use the term melancholic to describe someone who's depressed or unhappy. And so Galen's theory was prevalent for over 1,000 years and continued to be popular throughout the Middle Ages. And he was one of the first people to promote the theory that mental disorders could have psychological causes, such as stress or maladaptive relationships or experiences in life. Another example from this time period is the example of hysteria. Around 1900 BC, we found historians have found many papyri from Egypt that describe women who suffered from physical and mental illnesses that they believed or they attributed to a wandering uterus, that the uterus could somehow become dislodged inside the body and then move around inside the body, and that this movement or detachment of the uterus was the source of many problems such as pain or emotional symptoms. And as a result, the Egyptians and later the Greeks as well, they used strong smelling substances to try to lure the uterus back to its proper place in the body. And so this wandering uterus condition was later, is where we get the root word in Greek for hysteria. And so when we say the word hysteria today, we often mean an uncontrollable excess of emotion, but it's a controversial term because its history is rooted in something that was used actually to discriminate towards women, that women were prone to having wandering uteruses. And so therefore they were viewed as lesser beings than men because of this condition. And then in the Middle Ages, we saw a return to supernatural explanations. So with the rise of the power of the church, the Catholic Church in particular, particularly in Europe, religious ideologies regarding demonic possession, witchcraft, and being punished or paying penance for sins was viewed as a predominant explanation for psychological disorders. Then in the 18th century, as we moved into the Renaissance and this new age of scientific exploration, supernatural causes again gave way to more physical or medical explanations of ailments. So by the 18th century, people began to recognize that the mistreatment of mentally ill people or the notion that they could suffer because of their living conditions gained more prominence and gave rise to more systematic ways of treating people with psychological disorders. And so we see the rise of asylums in the 18th century, institutions created to house people with psychological disorders. And asylums, although at the time they were well accepted by society, we know that they were horrible places to be, that the focus was on ostracizing people with mental disorders from society rather than treating their illnesses. And patients were often kept in windowless dungeons and chained to beds and given really inhumane living conditions. And then in the 20th century, things have since then have on the surface anyway, improved since the days of asylums. We have the rise of antipsychotic medications in the 1950s that have proved useful for treating symptoms of schizophrenia. And we also have replaced asylums with community health centers as well as psychiatric hospitals that are more focused on short-term care. So for example, here in Detroit, we have places like the Detroit Central City Community Health Center, which because of legislation passed in the 1960s, all throughout the country, we have these community health centers that provide free or low-cost access to mental health care services and promote deinstitutionalization of people with mental disorders. And we also have, for those with more severe symptoms, psychiatric hospitals like Henry Ford Kingswood Hospital here on the right, where people stay for perhaps up to 2 weeks to get short-term intensive psychiatric care. However, we still see that many of the individuals who would benefit from psychiatric care do not receive it, that there's many barriers to accessing treatment for mental illness. And we'll discuss that a little bit more in detail next week. And that there's still so many places where people end up when they have psychological disorder, including jails, including prisons, including being deported, including many other ways, being homeless, that people with mental disorders continue to be ostracized and marginalized by society. And so now in the modern era, in the 21st century, the most common way of thinking about psychological disorders is the diathesis stress model of disorders, that people have some kind of underlying predisposition, a diathesis, which makes them more likely to develop a psychological disorder. And that when that predisposition is combined with some form of environmental stressor, that those two things together produce the expression of a mental disorder. So a diathesis can be something biological, it can be something psychological, it can be something social. So something, an example of psychological diathesis would be childhood trauma or sexual abuse. People who have experienced traumatic things in their childhood are more likely to go on to develop psychological disorders. So if you have college student A and college student B, college student A who has experienced psychological trauma and college student B who hasn't, and they both experience the same degree of stress in college and are about to flunk out, we would say that college student A is probably at greater risk for developing a disorder over student B because of their predisposition, because of the childhood trauma that they've experienced, even though they experience the same amount of stress. We also see social diatheses, things like poverty or inadequate education or other forms of systemic inequalities that make people more likely to experience psychological disorders, even with equivalent levels of stress. An example of a biological diathesis is that for schizophrenia. In schizophrenia, we see that the closer the genetic relationship with someone else who has schizophrenia, the higher your risk of developing schizophrenia yourself. So for example, if your first cousin has schizophrenia, you have about a 2% chance of developing schizophrenia yourself. Whereas if your identical twin has schizophrenia, the risk is 48%. So it's much bigger with a closer genetic relationship. And so in conclusion, mental disorders can be caused by a variety of factors. We now know that a combination of biological, psychological, and social influences are likely to cause most mental disorders. And that it's not just something as simple as just having a chemical imbalance in the brain. That line of thinking is wrong for many reasons. And I've attached a video here that you can take a look at on your own time to show why that is the case. And I was very happy to see that most people got the answer to this quiz question. The last thing I want to highlight in this video is a final disadvantage or side effect of the use of diagnostic labels, which is stigma. There's a certain stigma that comes with labeling psychological disorders, that people with psychological disorders carry around an aura or stigma about what it means for them, and that we treat mental disorders very differently than how we treat other forms of medical disease. So for example, when someone has a dental cavity, it's easy for people to say in their workplace or to their friends that they're going to the dentist or that they're going to have treatment for it, that they're getting help with it. When someone has cancer, it's easy to talk about going to fundraisers, and that when people finish their chemotherapy, and their hair is growing back, they're such an inspiration, and that their stories are used to, we describe them as heroes, or as, oh, they're so perseverant, and they did the same thing. They just went to go get help for the thing that was afflicting them. But when someone has a mental disorder, there's a tendency to view it as a problem of personal weakness, that if you have anxiety, it's because you have a character flaw, and that label sticks with you forever, that you're an anxious person, so that this is your character flaw. and that we tend to blame that person for the disorder. You don't blame someone necessarily for having cancer, even though there are lifestyle factors that could predict for some people having cancer. You don't tend to blame someone for having a cavity, even though there are probably also some behaviors that could be more preventative for having cavity. But when someone has a mental disorder, we tend to either explicitly or implicitly view that as that person's fault. And so on top of that, we make these labels stick, and and they're so they can have such negative effects. But at the same time, we often use these labels of mental disorders in everyday language, which minimizes their severity, makes us less likely to take someone seriously when they say they have a disorder. And so it's important to highlight that mental disorders are not adjectives; they are real phenomena that affect the lives of real people. And so it's improper to say that, oh, my mom yelled at me, but the day before she was happy. She's so bipolar, because that minimizes the experience of people who actually have a diagnosable mental illness, where they switch between states of depression and mania very quickly. Or to say that, oh, my insomnia is so bad because I'm having difficulty sleeping. Well, that is minimizing towards people who actually have insomnia and who experience distress, as well as functional disability, aren't able to work, aren't able to function properly in relationships because of their sleep, their diagnosable and biological sleep problems. Or to say, oh, that person is so they're such a perfectionist, they're so OCD. That's improper, because perfectionism is a trait that some people have, but it's not the same as someone who washes their hands 30 times per day because of a diagnosable fear and anxiety about contamination of bacteria that they're getting treatment for. And so, people with OCD don't just do it because it's their personality, or because they like washing their hands, or because they love cleaning. They're actually in misery. They're experiencing personal distress because of the thoughts that they're experiencing. And so it's important to be careful about the language that we use. I would encourage you to say, to also humanize people who experience mental disorders. So to not label them with the disorder. So for example, you could say, instead of saying my anorexic friend, you can say my friend who struggles with anorexia, or my friend who has OCD, versus giving them that label as who they are. And so it's important, in order to decrease stigma, that we use the stop technique to avoid stereotyping people with mental health conditions, to watch what we say and see if it's trivializing people with mental health conditions, or the condition itself, making it seem like it's just a joke, or it's just normal. Or watch the language that we use so that it doesn't offend people with mental health conditions, or that it doesn't patronize people, or promote the idea that they're not as good as other people. People should be able to seek help for the problems that they have, just like they do for other diseases. And so, two final warnings regarding the study of mental illness, psychological disorders, as we're going through the next few weeks of this class. That one, there's a tendency to over pathologize when learning about these disorders, that you begin to start seeing the symptoms in everyone. And so I'm going to ask you to keep in mind those three characteristics of psychological disorders: that there has to be some form that there likely will be some kind of personal distress, violation of social norms, as well as some form of disability or dysfunction. So not everyone who's anxious has an anxiety disorder. Not everyone who's perfectionistic has OCD. Not everyone who feels sad has major depression. And also, as you'll explore this week, there's a fine line between psychological disorders and personality. The examination of people's personalities and their traits is important. Some people who are introverted, they're just naturally introverted in social situations, get labeled with social anxiety. And that's not the right approach to take. It's important to examine very carefully the line between someone's personality trait and someone's behavior that causes them distress and disability in a real way.